Stalking is often dismissed as nuisance behavior, something uncomfortable, maybe even frightening, but rarely taken as the life-shattering crime it can be. The recent case of Sam Wall in the UK makes that painfully clear. What began as a fleeting encounter at a business event spiraled into years of obsessive harassment that destroyed reputations, wrecked livelihoods, and left victims in constant fear. And if a relatively unknown social media consultant could unleash that kind of damage unchecked, it forces us to ask, what happens when the target is one of the most famous people on the planet? Even someone like Steven Spielberg wasn't immune. This is the tale of how two people met for 30 seconds, and then one stalked the other for 4 years, and how even the most private of celebrities are liable to meet the same fate. Sam Wall was, on paper, an unremarkable figure. A 55-year-old social media consultant with a decent following, over 30,000 connections on LinkedIn, plus the usual presence across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But beneath that online polish, doctors would later confirm she carried a chronic delusional disorder. In November of 2023, she pleaded guilty to stalking and sending false communications against multiple victims. Her sentencing still looms, with the judge warning that prison is almost inevitable. The obsession that defined this case began all the way back in 2019, at something as ordinary as a Premier League football club networking event. Motivational speaker and event organizer Brad Burton met Wall for all of 30 seconds. She asked for a photo. He obliged, and she later posted a glowing review online, calling it a brilliant day filled with inspirational speakers who, quote, blew her away. That was it. No further interaction, no hidden connection. But that brief exchange was enough to trigger a spiral that would consume the next several years. 2 years later, in 2021, the fixation burst into public view. Wall began posting cryptic messages on Facebook. At first, she referred vaguely to, quote, a high-profile speaker. Soon it became a, quote, motivational speaker. And it didn't take long before her followers pieced it together. She was talking about Brad Burton. What followed was less than an accusation than a barrage, a campaign of lies, harassment, and character assassination that snowballed into what Brad himself described as a modern-day witch hunt. She accused him of everything imaginable. According to Wall, Brad sent henchmen to her house, issued daily death threats, smashed her windows, slashed her tires, even poisoned her cat. She claimed he destroyed her business, bought her house from underneath her, and had her harassed for a decade, all despite the fact they had only met for 30 seconds in 2019. At one point, she announced that Brad had been arrested and jailed for harassment, a claim she pushed so forcefully that Brad was forced to counter it by posting videos of himself casually reading the day's newspapers in a shop. When that unraveled, she invented a new story, that he had a, quote, psychopathic twin brother standing in for him to cover his tracks. She even alleged that he had her late mother's jewelry and photos thrown into a landfill by hired goons. Her method was relentless. Wall wrote sprawling social media posts, some stretching over 20,000 words, recycling them across every platform she had access to. She layered hashtags like gaslighting, manipulation, and sociopathic abuse, all to frame her narrative. She would repost the same content over and over and over again, often sharing memories of the old accusations as if to reinforce their permanence. Unlike traditional influencers who cultivate a glossy image, Wall weaponized reverse influencing, attempting to shape Brad's identity online as irredeemably vile. The consequences were devastating. Brad's business, once a thriving national networking organization worth over £1 million, collapsed and went insolvent. His reputation was shredded, with strangers quietly suspecting that there must be some truth to it. Every morning, he woke to dozens of notifications filled with her accusations. The stress sank deep, to the point he admitted he briefly considered suicide. And at home, as a father of 4, the poison of her obsession bled into his family life. All what began as a 30-second encounter had metastasized to years of torment. Not through physical violence, but through an unrelenting campaign of lies spread across the digital public square, and it all nearly destroyed him. But Brad Burton wasn't the only one dragged into Sam Wall's delusion. By 2021, her fixation had widened, pulling in others who barely knew her, but who suddenly found their names attached to the same grotesque accusations. One of them was Naomi Timperley, a tech entrepreneur from Manchester. Naomi had only ever seen Wall briefly, at 2 business events, and once sent her a private message encouraging her to resolve disputes offline. That simple exchange was enough to trigger the same spiral that Brad endured. Wall began flooding social media with claims that Naomi was harassing her, stalking her, sabotaging her business, all despite being arrested for harassment. Of course, none of it was true. Yet the lies spread across Instagram, LinkedIn, etc., forcing Naomi into a nightmare she later described as relentless and toxic. The impact reached far beyond her, too. Her husband and her children lived in constant fear that Wall might appear at their doorstep. And when Wall posted that she had attempted suicide, quote, because of Naomi, it twisted the knife, leaving her with a crushing sense of guilt and responsibility for something that wasn't even real. The ordeal left her hypervigilant, anxious, and unable to shake the suspicion that more might come. Another target was Justine Wright, a marketing consultant who had actually hired Wall a decade earlier for freelance social media work. When Justine later replaced her with a permanent manager, Wall never forgot. Years later, she resurfaced with waves of harassment, abusive messages about Justine's business, her team, and her clients. Before long, Justine too was sucked into the conspiracy surrounding Brad Burton. Wall accused her of, quote, gang stalking, of poisoning the cat again, of breaking into her home yet again. She even began targeting Justine's clients, spreading defamatory claims that threatened to unravel a business she had built over 3 decades. For Justine, the harassment was deeply personal. She admitted it sometimes reduced her to tears, leaving her anxious, emotional, and fearful of reputational collapse. Her only defense was to block, ignore, and disengage, a strategy that sometimes worked in the short term, but never for long. The harassment would flare up again years later, without warning. And through it all, she wrestled with the same corrosive stigma that clung to Brad and Naomi. The insidious thought that others might believe there was no smoke without fire. Wall's obsession didn't just destroy reputations and businesses. It infiltrated homes, family homes. It terrified those said families and left her victims living in constant dread of what she might do next. Unfortunately, they wouldn't be the last. When news outlets like BBC and the Daily Mail dug deeper, they uncovered a long trail of other victims, some who had been stalked for more than a decade. One man described receiving thousands of texts and emails, some messages spiraling into 10,000 words each. Wall even impersonated his wife at his workplace, accusing him of domestic abuse. Others had no real interaction with her at all, yet still found themselves dragged into her web, stalked and defamed by a woman they'd never actually met. The pattern was always the same: long, obsessive online rants that blurred reality with delusion, conspiracies about gang stalking, elaborate fantasies where she painted herself as the victim of harassment while projecting abuse onto anyone unlucky enough to cross her path. By the time she pleaded guilty, November 2023, Wall's behavior had already spiraled far beyond repair. A psychiatric report cited chronic delusions, and she even breached her bail conditions, liking an Instagram post from Naomi's husband, despite the looming sentencing. Judge Neil Usher, clearly skeptical of her capacity to stop, warned that prison was likely. Yet for years, victims have been sounding alarms with Greater Manchester Police. Complaints dated back to 2022. But officers were accused of being slow, dismissive, or simply unable to grasp the severity of online stalking. The result was predictable. Victims felt abandoned. And they weren't wrong. Data from the Susie Lamplick Trust shows fewer than 2% of reported stalking cases ever end in conviction. The Cyber Helpline estimates more than 600,000 people in the UK alone report online stalking every year, yet most never see meaningful justice. Social media platforms fared no better. Wall's content was actually reported repeatedly, but even after her conviction, the abusive posts remained online. LinkedIn issued nothing more than a generic statement about not allowing bullying or harassment, offering no case-specific comment. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter ignored media requests for comment altogether. It laid bare the reality. Platforms that profit off engagement were in no rush to act, even when engagement was built on the harassment of real people. For those caught in Wall's crosshairs, this was psychological warfare. The attacks were relentless, and the lies took on lives of their own, destroying reputations, shattering trust, and fueling anxiety that swept into every corner of their families and work. And as damaging as her campaign was, what made it worse was the silence around it, the years of inaction by police, the loopholes exploited on social media, the court delays that dragged out her victims' torment. Sam Wall may be one woman, but her case is emblematic of a much bigger epidemic: the weaponization of social media to stalk, defame, and terrorize people into silence. A crime hiding in plain sight, dismissed until it's too late. The scariest aspect of stalking in the modern age is the idea it can happen to anyone. It could happen to me, to you, to people who rarely leave their house, or to the people who travel every day of the year and never stay in one place for long. All it takes is one misplaced interaction with the wrong person, and the rest is history. There has long been a common misconception in society that with enough money and resources, you can shield yourself from a potential stalker. After all, if you're famous enough, you probably have multiple wannabe stalkers at any given time. So, pay a few extra bucks, and the problem will go away. Right? While it might have been true 100 years ago, the modern age has made it impossible for any one person to completely avoid the stalker's prying eyes. That includes literal billionaires like Steven Spielberg, whose own experience with a violent stalker nearly ended in a vicious murder that would have changed the landscape of American history, if not for a miracle in bad timing. In the summer of 1997, Steven Spielberg, one of the most recognizable names in the cinematic arts, became the target of a man named Jonathan Norman, a 31-year-old who had developed a cold-blooded obsession with him Over the course of June and July, Norman made repeated visits to Spielberg's Pacific Palisades mansion before finally being arrested inside the property in July. What police found on him was chilling. Handcuffs, duct tape, a box cutter, razor blades, and a notebook filled with photos of Spielberg, along with his wife Kate Capshaw and their 7 children. In his car were 2 more sets of handcuffs, a day planner packed with the family's personal information, and what prosecutors bluntly described as a rape kit, a collection of sadomasochistic sex aids and tools that made his intentions impossible to dismiss. Norman told detectives outright that he planned to rape Spielberg, to hold his family hostage, and possibly kill him in front of them. It was a plot pulled straight out of a horror film, only this time, the target wasn't a fictional character, but one of the most famous directors alive. If Spielberg or any of his family members had come home before the police were alerted, well, we'll leave that to your imagination. Spielberg himself took the stand in February 1998, testifying for 90 minutes about the fear Norman instilled in him. He described him as uniquely terrifying, unlike any other overzealous fan or pushy admirer he'd encountered in his decades-long career. No one before has ever come into my life in a way to do me harm, he said, explaining that he believed Norman was on a mission, and that mission was him. Spielberg admitted that even months later, he still felt like prey. In his words, quote, "Had Jonathan Norman actually confronted me, I genuinely, in my heart of hearts, believe that I would have been raped or maimed or killed." In court, Spielberg avoided eye contact with Norman. On the rare occasion he glanced in his direction, Norman refused to meet his eyes. Though witnesses noted, he smirked as Spielberg spoke. That detail alone underscored what made this case so haunting: the smirk of a man who saw one of the most celebrated filmmakers in the world not as an artist, but as an object. You see, Jonathan Norman wasn't some harmless eccentric swept up in celebrity fantasy. He was a repeat offender spiraling into a dangerous obsession. At the time of his arrest, he was just 31 years old, already carrying 2 prior felony convictions, and on parole for an assault case out of Santa Monica. He was also deep in a cycle of crystal meth abuse. Friends later testified that in the weeks leading up to his arrest, he was snorting meth almost daily, leaving him paranoid, erratic, and unable to sleep. One friend, Charles Markovich, initially told a grand jury that Norman openly admitted he wanted to rape Spielberg. By the time trial came around, he backpedaled, claiming Norman had only wanted to, quote, act out a script idea and break into Spielberg's home to pitch himself for work in Hollywood. But even as he softened his story, Markovich could not deny the obvious. Norman was unraveling, consumed by meth, and slipping into dangerous instability. The prosecution argued there was nothing abstract about Norman's intentions. He had shown up to Spielberg's home at least 4 separate times, carried with him a so-called rape kit, and kept detailed notes about Spielberg's family. They painted him as a man sexually obsessed and unwilling to stop. Spielberg himself begged the court to keep him behind bars, saying plainly, quote, "If he's out on the street, I will live in fear." The prospect that Jonathan Norman might have another opportunity to carry out his threats is beyond frightening to me. The jury convicted him of felony stalking in March 1998, and Judge Steven Suzukawa handed down a sentence of 25 years to life under California's 3 strikes law. The judge called him, quote, "obsessive and frightening," adding, quote, "I think he does present a danger to society." Spielberg didn't return for the sentencing. After testifying, he wanted no further proximity to the man who had so vividly threatened his life. The case drew immediate comparisons to other celebrity stalkings of the era. Madonna endured years of terror from Robert Hoskins, who once threatened to slice her from ear to ear and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Cher, Olivia Newton-John, Michael J. Fox, all of them had their own stalkers. And in the most infamous case, John Hinckley Jr. attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan in a delusional bid to impress Jodie Foster. It goes without saying, money does not buy you protection in modern America. But Spielberg's order stood out as one of the most chilling examples of the 1990s. The evidence against Norman was undeniable. Handcuffs, duct tape, blades, and a notebook detailing the lives of his intended victims. His meth-driven paranoia only amplified an already dangerous fixation. And even for a man with Spielberg's fame, wealth, and security, the reality was all but clear. He was vulnerable. At the time of Norman's arrest, Spielberg had been filming Saving Private Ryan in Ireland. The call from his lawyer first left him in disbelief, then spiraled into fear and anger. He increased security on film sets and at his home, fully aware of the difference between eccentric fandom and the kind of threat Norman posed. If you want to know the long-term psychological consequences stalking leaves its victims with, remember this. The increased security I just mentioned remains true over 20 years later to this day, and I say that with first-hand experience. I used to work as a security guard for Universal Studios, the backlot where Spielberg's production company, Amblin Entertainment, rents out its office space. Universal itself has a pretty stringent security protocol, but it pales in comparison to the security protocol for Amblin. It's a gated community inside of a gated community. The walls are so high, the foot traffic throughout the Universal backlot cannot see into Amblin's windows or courtyards. Spielberg also handpicks his security personnel himself. In addition to armed security agents with law enforcement and ex-military backgrounds posted throughout Amblin 24/7, Spielberg also asks for the cream of the crop of the traffic and corporate security officers to be placed in his command center. He wants guards who are attentive, intelligent, and aren't likely to pull out their phone while on post and cause distractions. Spielberg also frequents his control room. Security officers at Amblin constantly monitor the security camera feeds, a CCTV system as robust as those seen in classified, top-secret federal government buildings. In person, himself. You'd think a billionaire artist with the resources of Steven Spielberg wouldn't have the time or interest to check security footage throughout the day. But that's what Jonathan Norman did to him, did to his psyche, his emotional well-being, and what stalkers do to their victims every single day, mostly without us even knowing. In his own words, Steven Spielberg said he felt like prey. Brad Burton, Naomi Timperley, and Justine Wright, they felt like prey too. These cases, famous or not, became a stark example of how obsession, left unchecked, can escalate into something far more dangerous than fandom or attraction, and how the law sometimes struggles to keep pace until it's almost too late.